What's up, everybody? It's FYGP, and today I want to talk about this documentary by Deutsche Welle. It came out on the 23rd of February 2018, and it's called Who is Putin? I think that's the title. And as you can see, it has around 1,000 likes and around 800 dislikes. So, really, I mean, the propaganda is really obvious in this documentary, and that is why I think so many people disliked it. I just want to kind of deconstruct what is going on here and what they're talking about and bring you some of the facts about the issues that they're talking about. Let's take a listen. So I'm just gonna start off with the invasion of Crimea because they go back and revise all of the history regarding the Russia NATO confrontation that is going on right now and talk about it as if NATO is completely innocent in this situation, which is, of course, not the case.
One sovereign state, Ukraine, had been invaded by another, Russia.
We were surprised when he went into Crimea. We saw that this was a potential, but it was a surprise that he did it in the way he did.
His goal is to keep Ukraine destabilized and to make sure that it never completes any kind of Western orientation.
He's not, as we like to think of him, especially here in the US, a grand strategic thinker and chess player. He plays blackjack. You know, it's a very high acceptance of risk. And that's a very Russian mentality. There's a Russian word called avos, which is like, basically, I'll wing it and see what happens.
Obama called Putin and talked for more than an hour, threatening him with sanctions if he went ahead and annexed Crimea. But Putin ignored the threats from...
Threatening him. That is what it is all about, right? Sorry, my internet is so slow. That is why we gotta watch this on 144p for the true Slav experience. Come on, internet, please.
the West and went even
there we go.
further. In the summer of 2014, Russian troops without uniforms started arriving in Donbass, an eastern region of Ukraine, to support
So yeah, it is true that Putin probably put in his special forces in eastern Ukraine. I mean, one of the generals was called Igor Girkin or Igor Strelkov, and he is a Russian citizen who has fought in many wars for Russia. And he's a very capable general, that's for sure. And he actually proposed to the Russians to just go ahead and march in with the real Russian army with a full-scale invasion of eastern Ukraine. In the first couple of days of the crisis, he wanted to do that, and that would have probably prevented the long-term conflict that we see right now. But as it stands right now, Russia is supporting their proxies, and they're, basically these people in eastern Ukraine, they are ethnically Russian, they speak Russian, they have Russian heritage. That is not what they're going to tell you in this documentary, are they? And they're not going to tell you that, the Maidan coup was completely orchestrated by the West as a sort of color revolution. Let's move on with this.
Russian separatist rebels against the new government in Kiev. It started a dirty war.
What did they want? 500 miles from Moscow. They wanted us to stay and see how they would kill our people there. So we have to protect ourselves. And it means that to protect our interests near our borders.
I like this guy. He's completely right. What do they want 500 miles from Moscow? Or like 500 miles from the Russian border? Ukraine is right there. It's right there. What are they doing there in the first place? I mean, when the Soviet Union stationed nukes in Cuba and everything, I mean, we had almost had World War III, right? I mean, right now we have NATO troops and so-called missile defense fields in Eastern Europe, just a couple of 100 miles away from the Russian border. And of course, this is tension. This is tension, right? And the tension is not coming from Russia, because Russia has its troops within its own borders for the most part. I mean, Russia has no foreign military bases and no huge military alliance such as NATO. The Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. It's completely different. I mean, they are basically on the doorsteps of Russia with Ukraine.
The West suspected Malofeyev of financing separatists and imposed sanctions on him. For Putin and his entourage, the war came at a price.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Начнем с ситуации вокруг Украины, вокруг Крыма. Эта тема напрямую затрагивает и нашу национальную
Around
безопасность.
50 people from Putin's circle were banned from traveling to the West, and their assets abroad were frozen. Both Europe and the US.
Okay, so of course the sanctions, really they could give a shit less about that. Those people who were banned from traveling to the West and some of the, I'm sure the, frozen assets. I mean, they have assets in Russia too. They can give a shit less. So,
imposed heavy sanctions on oil exports.
Heavy sanctions on oil exports. That is obviously something Russia did not like and still is struggling with. Because, of course, as a countermeasure, they just produce more of their own oil. The U.S. has massive oil and gas resources as well, and is one of the biggest producers of those both two resources. Nobody's ever going to tell you that, because they want you to think that, it's like we are running out of resources, so you can embrace the Agenda 2030 bullshit with sustainable development. But that's a whole other topic. So Russia suffered because of these extremely low oil prices that were mainly manufactured by Saudi Arabia and the US producing more oil. And of course, the more oil you have on the markets, the lower the price is. And this actually is the only thing that the West can do against Russia, because as we saw right now with the most recent speech of Putin, he has nuclear reactor-powered orbital ballistic missiles that can basically wipe out any place in the Earth from, just from Russia, and it's undetectable for NATO shields. A nuclear cruise missile is another project that he presented. But let's move on with this documentary, right? It's really propaganda. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a Russian, pro-Russian. I don't care about Russia, but as I see it, this is not the true story of what really happened.
And armaments.
Сергей Викторович, что по этому поводу могли бы нам сказать и проинформировать о чем?
Президент Обама объявил о новых санкциях, которые касаются примерно 20, опять же, физических лиц и одного финансового учреждения Банка России.
Сколько физических лиц?
Около 20.
In February 2015, Putin finally agreed a ceasefire negotiated with the Western powers in Minsk. He had the upper hand in a conflict that he could ratchet up at will. He had ensured that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO or the European Union.
Exactly, because a country that is in conflict is not allowed to join NATO by NATO's own charter. So Ukraine will never have the chance to join NATO, which obviously angers them and irks them to no end. And one of the most important parts of Ukraine, which is Crimea, strategically very important because it's right there in the Black Sea. Who controls Crimea controls the Black Sea pretty much. So, right, I mean, they're pissed about Ukraine. They lost that conflict as well.
Near future. But at what cost? 2015 saw great celebrations to mark the 70th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over National Socialism.
Over Nazi Germany, not Nazi Germany, not National Socialism. Well, of course, you can also phrase it that way, but they're not going to tell you, oh, they defeated Hitler, right? Russia defeated Hitler. They're not going to tell you that. They're just going to say, oh, National Socialism. What National Socialism? Where? Which country? It wasn't National Socialism versus Russia. It was the Soviet Union versus Nazi Germany. Ridiculous.
But the pump was deceptive.
The pump was deceptive?
Western sanctions had an impact on the economy. The ruble had collapsed, and even the military budget had to be cut back. Putin had promised the Russians glory, but they had paid dearly for that vision. Prices were rising.
The sanctions, right? Because whenever there is a country that doesn't do exactly what we want and let them be our bitches and, make coups in fucking places such as Ukraine that are right there on its border. I mean, whenever we have a country who doesn't like that and fights back, actually, we need to impose sanctions on them for being, invading Ukraine and taking Crimea and doing this and that. Who imposed sanctions on the United States for invading Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, any country, Libya? Come on, don't be ridiculous. Sorry, we just gotta bear through this. I don't know. I think my fucking fast internet that I had just turned into really slow internet, so now we gotta watch videos on 144p and bear through the fucking buffering. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Poverty was increasing, but he remained deaf to the worries of Russian business leaders. What mainly preoccupied him was the fact that he had become a pariah at the head of a...
Come on, bitch.
15 saw prices were rising, poverty was increasing, but he remained deaf to the worries of Russian business leaders. What mainly preoccupied him was the fact that he had become a pariah at the head of an ostracized state. The refusal of Western leaders to participate in this important anniversary was a devastating humiliation.
The refusal, right? The Western leaders, so-called Western leaders, I mean bankster puppets really, is what they are. The Western leaders didn't show up to the 70-year anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. They didn't show up to that, even though they were invited. I mean that's really more an embarrassment for them because if you want to celebrate something, then it's probably the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. I mean, that's something we can all agree on, and the United Kingdom and the United States were allies of the Russians during World War II. So shouldn't we all celebrate this victory, the fall of Berlin, and the end of the Second World War, the worst conflict in human history, together? Shouldn't we do that? No, but allegedly, according to Deutsche Welle, the German TV station, Putin is really irked that nobody of these Western leaders showed up, and he was pissed that Angela Merkel wasn't sitting there next to him. I mean, he had the Chinese president. Who cares if any Western leader came? The Chinese guy came. I mean, China is the biggest economy right now in the world. Fuck you guys.
Worse still, the man who wanted to rebuild Russia as a world power was even excluded from the G8, the summit of the world's leaders.
Oh yeah, excluded from the G8, right? So China is not in the G8, even though China is probably more powerful than Italy. Italy is in the G8. Right? So yeah, the G8, as if that means anything. That's just basically a meeting of EU and NATO puppets. The G8 is. The G7, I should say. The G8 that includes Russia. I mean, come on. As if he gives a shit about being excluded from that. The G8 matters, and